look, the South China Sea is only 1% of our overall relations with China. The other 99%, we have a good relations. Should we abandon that 1% for that 99%? As the US Cambodia defense relations has got worse from year to year, the Chinese took advantage of it and began to provide first simple equipment like trucks, uniform, and subsequently they began to conduct joint military exercises.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Abdul Rahman Yaacob. Hi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
He is a research fellow at the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute. I would like to ask you a few topics about the current situation in Asia. We would start with the tensions between China and its three neighbors, Taiwan, Japan, and Philippines. I would like you to tell us a little bit the regional context. Maybe it's a testing ground for the reliability of the US.
Yeah. Uh, yes, I think that is a very interesting question. These are actually potential flashpoint in Asia, Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines. I think as most people will know, Taiwan, the Chinese consider Taiwan as a part of China, and uh, and any efforts that they see or the Chinese perceive as the Taiwan going to be an independent country, I think the Chinese will respond from a military perspective. In the case of Japan and the Philippines, the Chinese have a maritime disputes with these two countries. Yeah, so in the case of Japan, it's over the Senkakus Islands. In the case of the Philippines, it's in the South China Sea. And so when you mention about whether this the testing ground for the reliability of the US, that is a very, very good question, I think. But before I go any further, maybe may I provide some perspective for my engagement with defense officials from the ASEAN country, the Association of Southeast Asian Nation. Yeah. So basically, there are two main points that influence how regional countries look at the US and China. Uh, so number one, the US is perceived as a distant power, while China is in their backyard. Yeah. So they have to live and learn to live with China. So a senior naval officials from a maritime Southeast Asian country actually pointed out to me sometimes ago that in any military conflict with China, the US could disengage and return to the other side of the Pacific. But ASEAN countries will still have to deal with China because China is their neighbor. There's nowhere else they can go. Number two, the US is seen as a declining power in some of the states. So, about 2 years ago, a Southeast Asian country conducted a strategic study about China and the US. So, that study involved their defense officials, Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials, and also those from the trade and finance. So, they assessed that they had to realign their relations with America and China because there's some questions about the Americans' commitment to the regions in the long term. One, the US is seen as not economically competitive as China, and of course, because of that, that particular Southeast Asian country believe they should establish closer relations with China and then to the US. This is quite a common viewpoint across several countries in the region. So again, these 2 points, the proximity of China and US relative power influence how regional countries perceive and engage the Americans and the Chinese. And let me get back to the questions again. Uh, I think President Biden has stated a few times that he is committed to defend Taiwan, but now we have a new environment in America. We have Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So will they continue with what President Biden have actually promised? Yeah. So this is where the third point, history, comes to play. For many ASEAN officials, they look at history and they learn from the past. Uh, just a very good point. So during the Cold War, during the fight against communism, I think President John F. Kennedy, in his speech in 1961, he said that the American will pay any price, bear any burdens, meet any hardship to assure the survival and the success of liberty. But yet, less than 10 years later, under Richard Nixon, he announced the Guam Doctrine. Basically, the US is going to encourage and has the right to expect that the problem in Asia should be handled by the Asians themselves. So at that point in time, some of the Southeast Asian countries have seen that the Americans are actually pulling back their commitment to the region. A Cambodian official told me because of that, in 1975, the Khmer took over power that led to the killing of more than 1 million Cambodians. So against there, these are questions about the American commitment from the historical perspective and even the contemporary period.
Yes, as of now, we don't see really much commitment from the Biden administration. If we look at the Philippines, I mean, there is so much more to do, and many people like to criticize President Duterte, but he was left out in the cold twice in the second
Mm.
term show, and so the Obama administration didn't really care very much about what's going on in the Philippines. So we can very much understand those concerns. But in the absence of the hub, the spokes cooperate closer. So we had the Philippine Air Force in Australia recently in an
Mhm.
exercise involving 20 countries and 140 aircraft. We had the visiting agreement with Japan, reciprocal access agreement. And also in April, Australia, Japan, and the United States with the Philippines held a Navy cooperation exercise in the South China Sea. So it looks like the neighbors are slowly pulling together and they maybe rely less on the US. What do you think is happening?
Yes, I think it's quite a good development because we are not. I believe that the regional countries should not rely totally on the US because of there's something about the Americans that at this point in time there is a lot of uncertainty about the American politics. So when I look at the development across the Indo-Pacific region, we have the South Korean working well with the Japanese now. Of course, brought them together. All these developments shows that the middle power in the regions are taking steps to support ASEAN country in terms of their security. I think this is a very good and necessary development because we have seen what happened in Europe when Donald Trump threatens to cut off support to NATO. This is something that I think regional countries say, look, let's uh, let's pick up speed, let's spend more on defense and fill the gap. Uh, and of course, I think the Americans cannot do it alone. Even if if there's a military conflict against China, it has to rely on its allies in the region, because again, the Americans are a few thousand kilometers away from the region. It has to have access to bases, military bases, air bases, naval bases in the region in any military conflicts with China. Yeah, that's one. Uh, but again, this is a very good development, and I foresee that we may have more minilateral defense arrangement in the region. At the same time, more bilateral defense arrangement like the one between the Philippines and Japan will be developed.
This channel is my passion, and yet those videos take time and effort to make. By liking this video, you can help push the ever-hostile algorithm in my favor. I'm very grateful for it.
Good. Let's look at the second tier flashpoints with China, like Vietnam and Malaysia.
Yeah. Mm, Again, how Vietnam and Malaysia engage China, there's one thing that they have to consider. China is a key trading partner for both countries. Therefore, I think both the Vietnamese and the Malaysians they employ a soft strategy to deal with China in the South China Sea dispute. Um, I give you an example. A Vietnamese officials told me that look, the South China Sea is only 1% of our overall relations with China. The other 99%, we have a good relations. Should we abandon that 1% for that 99%? So that's a very good point that the Vietnamese pointed out to me. And as for the Malaysians, if you look recently, that the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has been given seems to be a pro-Chinese statement. Uh, so what I understand is that again, China is critical for Malaysia to develop its economy further, and I think Anwar Ibrahim is playing the long term game and saying that, look, let's try to engage China diplomatically. Of course, at the same time, we should build up our military capabilities. So, again, I think the Malaysians believe that a good approach to deal with China is to keep the disputes away from the public eyes as much as possible, uh, so that they can extract economic benefit from China. But at the same time, they are also building up their military capabilities slowly and quietly. I'll give you one example. The Malaysians recently have announced that they are looking at getting a new batch of combat aircraft from the Kuwaitis. And of course, they had also conducted joint military exercises with the Americans. Yeah. So this is a hedging strategy by Malaysia. Yeah.
We have this recent Pew survey result, and
Yeah.
the question was about how much does China contribute to global peace and stability, and it scored really well, especially in
Mhm.
Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Sri Lanka. So how can you explain that?
Yeah. Okay, one, I would like to highlight another research or survey conducted by the Institute of Southeast Asian Study recently. It shows that the level of support for China is higher than the US. Yeah. So uh, I think one of the reasons is the crisis in the Middle East actually have affected how some how peoples or policymakers and the ordinary peoples in the regions look at the US and China. So that's one. Uh, the other thing that I would like to highlight is that, look, again, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and even in the Philippines, China is is a important economic and trading partner for them, and the Chinese are very good at marketing their investment in infrastructure and their aid to this country. Uh, and I think that's also shaped some of their perceptions about the Chinese. Let me give an example. Between 2015 and 2021, China provided about 40% of official development finance, or ODF, we call it, to countries in Southeast Asia. About 28 billions in infrastructure alone to ASEAN country. So on average, China's gave ASEAN country about $4 billion a year. And how they market this aid is very effective. I think you can, if I went to, when I was in Cambodia, for example, I've seen a lot of big signages to show that this is Chinese investment, Chinese helping the Cambodians. So a lot of this publicity actually help the ordinary people to look at China in a positive term. I think the other thing is that China have also managed to demonstrate that it is an international actor that could bring peace to the Middle East. I think about a few years ago, China was able to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together to reset their relations. That's one. And I understand that just the past 24 hours, or just slightly more than 24 hours ago, Beijing have actually brought in all the Palestinian faction to come together uh, and to come up with some government structure once the war or the conflict in the Middle East has ended. So again, this kind of development actually demonstrate to the countries in the region that uh, China is a responsible actor. Let me quote one example that a Malaysian general actually told me. He is concerned about the way the Americans engage ASEAN. Uh, According to his perspective, the Americans often talk about uh, security angles, they use security angles, security concerns to engage ASEAN. But according to him, China is very smart. China is using a win-win concept. Uh, Whenever China engages ASEAN, it's about business, about investment, about infrastructure development. So the quote that he shared with me was this: "When the American engage us, it is the language of conflict. But when the Chinese engage us, it is the language of win-win cooperations. Who will you choose?"
Yes, I guess he could ask the Taiwanese, Filipinos, and Japanese. I think they might tell him It's not always just a language of peace. I would challenge him here. But you,
Yeah.
you mentioned Cambodia. That's really my next question. I think you visited recently. Did you visit the Ream naval base, or you were just in the vicinity? I know that you've been there, and I wanted to ask you about your takeaway from this visit.
Yeah. I think part of my visits to Ream Naval Base and also the engagement with the commander of that base is to understand the broader Cambodian strategic visions. I think what I've seen so far is that the development in Ream Naval Base is part of the Cambodian military modernization program. Uh, One of the reasons that they are pursuing or pushing hard for a military modernization program is their security concerns. There's a bit of dynamic there in mainland Southeast Asia. Cambodia is concerned about Thailand and Vietnam, and it has to look for an external partner to help it to modernize its military forces. I give you a bit of data. For example, the Thais and the Vietnamese, their defense budget is about $6 billion per year. The Cambodians spend only less than $1 billion. So you can see the gap there. So and how can a small country, poor country like Cambodia, develop its armed forces? It has to look at foreign power, somewhere a country that is outside the region. And of course, China is willing to fill up the gap. And one of the observations that I found is that as the U.S. Cambodia defense relations has got worse from year to year, the Chinese took advantage of it and began to provide first simple equipment like trucks, uniform, and subsequently they began to conduct joint military exercises. So I understand that. I think the Chinese are also looking at to provide new ships to the Cambodian Navy, uh, and I think Ream Naval Base is part of the development in Ream Naval Base is part of the Cambodian modernization program in the maritime domain, and of course the Chinese is more than happy to support the Cambodian in order to win political influence in that country.
I'm curious because that's really a rarely discussed topic. What other insights do you have from the visit in Cambodia? You said you met this general, then any other maybe officers or maybe like regular people or maybe some scholars. What's your takeaway from your trip to Cambodia?
Yeah. So beside the Cambodian defense officials, government officials, so I met up with a few former ministers, politicians, and also critics of the government, think tanks, academics. So I tried to have a broader perspective about Cambodia. But again, one unique thing that I found is that there is a general consensus that Cambodia is a small country sandwiched between two larger powers that have threatened them previously. So they look at the Thai, they look at the Vietnamese. Both these countries have actually invaded and occupied Cambodia before in the past. And I think that siege mentality uh, drive them to develop their defense capabilities. It is a familiar thing. I mean, Singapore, for example, is a good, I would say, another example, like what's going on in Cambodia now. Singapore has been concerned about the Malaysians and the Indonesians, a small country sandwiched between two larger powers. So, in the case of Singapore in the 60s and 70s, in fact, up to the 1990s, it looks at the US to support it in its military modernization program. So, Cambodia, because of the poor state of defense relations with the US, turned to China.
Studio Asia is an independent channel. I am neither looking for sponsors, nor asking you for donations. I value much more your comment under this interview. It means a lot to me, a lot. Subscribing and sharing helps me to be promoted by YouTube. I will appreciate it very, very much.
Great. Thank you very much. My last question would be, you travel a lot in the region, you talk to different people. So what's your general impression of the attitudes? Because I think your view was quite unique. It seems like the region is quite friendly to China, from what I could tell. That might probably surprise many viewers. So could you please talk a little bit more to that?
Okay, ASEAN as a whole, it's a unique regional organizations where most of its member states are still of developing countries, actually, with the exception of Singapore. So they are looking at export trades as something that can pull them away from poverty. Cambodia, for example, Myanmar, Laos, in fact, Indonesia too. So any country or any power that actually uh, facilitate trades, that is something that ASEAN country will actually try to set up a closer relations with. I'll give you some data. For example, ASEAN trade with China is about 720 billion US dollars. That was in 2022. Uh, the value of trade with the US is 420 billion US dollars. So there's a $300 billion gap there. Yeah. So of course, if China is the one that is providing the trade for you, I mean, there's something that you want to set up closer relations with China. But having said that, beyond that trade, China, I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier, China provides quite a lot of support in terms of infrastructure development. We have the first high-speed railway in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, from Jakarta to Bandung. It was built with Chinese money, yeah, and the Chinese investments are quite heavily uh, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Thailand, in fact, in Brunei too. So, because of ASEAN's reliance on trade and open trade, so they are looking at the Chinese as a very uh, essential or important partners in that part of in that area. And if you look at the American, for example, now we have the talks about putting up tariff. Donald Trump's threatened to impose 10% tariff if he's elected into power. uh, what we can see is that trade with the Americans may be affected, and that is something that ASEAN countries will not feel very comfortable with. They prefer an open trading system. They prefer free trade if possible, and of course, for many of the poor ASEAN country, they would really appreciate to be given some support to develop their infrastructure.
Rahman, thank you very much for your time and for your insights. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you very much, Richard.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.